The Zephyrian Institute of Xenolinguistics had always prided itself on being the galaxy's premier authority on civilized communication. Their crystalline spires gleamed with the self-satisfaction of a species that had convinced half the known universe that proper pronunciation was directly proportional to evolutionary advancement. How delightfully convenient for a race whose vocal cords naturally produced sounds reminiscent of wind chimes having an orgasm. Professor Velixia Kethma stood at the center of Harmony's Edge Station's grand amphitheater, her translucent skin shimmering with a kind of smugness that only came from centuries of academic tenure and zero real-world experience. The annual Galactic Communication Symposium buzzed around her like a hive of particularly pretentious bees, each delegate more eager than the last to demonstrate their linguistic superiority over the lesser worlds. The hierarchy was as predictable as it was ridiculous. At the top sat the crystalline hegemony with their musical speech patterns, followed by the ethereal confederation whose members communicated through interpretive dance and passive aggression. The middle tiers housed species who had at least mastered the art of sounding important while saying absolutely nothing, a skill Velixia had elevated to an art form. And at the bottom, naturally, were the Deathworlders, those unfortunate beings whose planets had the audacity to challenge them with actual survival requirements instead of polite, drawing-room conversations. The correlation between phonetic sophistication and societal development, Velixia was explaining to a cluster of admirers, her voice producing harmonics that made nearby wine glasses hum in sympathy, remains one of our field's most reliable indicators. Consider the brutal consonant clusters of the Crexian miners, or the guttural vowel distortions common to methane-breathing species. Primitive environments produce primitive speech patterns. It's simply evolutionary inevitability. Her audience nodded with the enthusiasm of academics, who had never encountered an original thought they couldn't immediately classify and dismiss. The irony that most of them communicated primarily through pheromone release or bioluminescent displays seemed lost on everyone present. That's when the doors to the amphitheater opened with a mechanical wheeze that suggested someone had forgotten to oil the hinges sometime during the previous century. The conversations didn't stop immediately. Academic gatherings possessed the momentum of dying stars, but they certainly shifted into that particular register of polite interest that universally translated to "Who the hell is this?" Kai Brennan entered like a man who had never heard of the concept of making an entrance, which was refreshing in a space station populated entirely by beings who treated every doorway like a personal theater. He was unmistakably human, with a kind of practical clothing that suggested he had places to be and things to accomplish, rather than impressions to cultivate. His hair looked like it had been cut by someone who understood the basic principle of scissors, but had never heard of styling, and his posture suggested someone comfortable with gravity that actually meant something. "Sorry I'm late," he said, and every linguist in the room simultaneously winced. The accent was unmistakably terrestrial, carrying the particular flavor of industrial districts and practical concerns. His vowels had the audacity to sound like they were actually intended for communication rather than performance art. The consonants struck the air with the efficiency of a species that had learned language as a tool rather than a status symbol. Velixia's crystalline features rearranged themselves into an expression of delighted horror. Here, walking into the hallowed halls of linguistic refinement, was everything she had spent her career studying from a safe distance. A genuine, unfiltered example of Deathworld communication patterns, complete with the kind of accent that suggested the speaker had learned their pronunciation from people who actually worked for a living. "How fascinating," she murmured, her harmonics taking on the particular frequencies that her species used to indicate intellectual curiosity mixed with social superiority. A Terran delegate. How wonderfully authentic. Kai approached the registration desk with the steady gait of someone accustomed to environments where a misstep might result in actual consequences rather than social embarrassment. The registration clock, a being whose species had evolved from something that might charitably be described as a singing mushroom, processed his credentials with a kind of careful attention usually reserved for handling volatile explosives. Kai Brennan, he read from his credentials, Terra University, Department of Applied Linguistics. Research focus, human vocal adaptation and dialectical flexibility. The clerk's translation device struggled briefly with the concept of applied linguistics, as if the idea of using language for practical purposes rather than theoretical masturbation was fundamentally incomprehensible. Velixia drifted closer with the predatory grace of an academic scenting fresh material for her next paper. Terra University, she repeated, her voice climbing to frequencies that made several nearby beings check their chronometers for no apparent reason. How charmingly practical. I don't believe I'm familiar with your institution's work in our field. Probably not, Kai replied with the kind of casual honesty that made every diplomat in the room break out in sympathetic hives. We tend to focus more on how people actually talk, rather than how they are supposed to talk. The silence that followed this statement could have been bottled and sold as a luxury commodity in academic circles, suggesting that descriptive linguistics might be more valuable than prescriptive linguistics was roughly equivalent to proposing that gravity was more guideline than law. Velixia's laugh tinkled like wind chimes being tortured by a particularly vindictive breeze. How delightfully naive. Of course, one can hardly expect sophisticated theoretical frameworks from institutions that prioritize functionality over refinement. The word functionality dripped from her vocal apparatus like something she had stepped in and was now trying to scrape off her shoe. Around them, other delegates began to drift closer with the instinctive curiosity of academics, sensing a potential intellectual bloodbath. Kai's response was a smile that suggested he had encountered this particular flavor of condescension before and found it mildly entertaining rather than offensive. Yeah, we get that a lot. Funny thing about functionality though, it tends to whack. Oh, I'm certain it serves its purpose, Velixia continued, warming to her subject like a solar collector focusing starlight. Basic communication needs, simple information transfer. Quite adequate for a species still working through its industrial phase. But surely you must recognize the limitations of such pragmatic approaches. She had shifted into full lecture mode now, her voice taking on the particular harmonics that her species used for addressing children or particularly slow pets. The other delegates formed a loose circle around them, drawn by the irresistible academic magnetism of watching someone about to be intellectually demolished. The Terran vocal apparatus, Velixia explained to her growing audience, while admirably robust for survival purposes, lacks the sophisticated modulatory capabilities necessary for truly advanced linguistic expression. The consonant clusters are brutally simplified, the tonal variations minimal, and don't get me started on the dialectical variations. She paused for the appreciative murmur that followed any academic's casual display of specialized knowledge. Take this young man's accent, for example, she continued, gesturing toward Kai with a casual dismissal of a professor indicating a particularly instructive specimen. The flattened vowels, the harsh consonantal endings, the complete absence of harmonic undertones. It's a perfect example of linguistic development constrained by environmental pressures. When your ancestors were focused on avoiding predation and securing basic resources, naturally the finer aspects of communication suffered. Kai nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering her analysis. Hey, that's an interesting theory. Mind if I ask what you base that on? The question hung in the air, with the particular weight of words that seemed innocent, but carried the potential for academic carnage. Velixia's crystalline features shifted through several configurations as she processed the implications. Well, naturally, the established literature on Deathworld linguistic development patterns. Comparative studies of species development under high-stress environmental conditions. Basic evolutionary phonetics. She rattled off the authorities with the confidence of someone who had never actually questioned whether those authorities might be talking out of their collective posteriors. Right, Kai said, maintaining that same thoughtful tone. And how many of those studies actually involved, humans? Like actual data collection from actual Terran linguistic communities. The silence that followed could have been used to calibrate precision instruments. In the rarefied atmosphere of galactic academia, suggesting that theoretical frameworks might benefit from actual empirical evidence was roughly equivalent to questioning whether the laws of physics were more like gentle suggestions. Velixia's harmonics took on frequencies typically associated with territorial disputes among her species. The methodological approaches are perfectly sound. Direct observation is hardly necessary when the theoretical foundations are so clearly established. Sure, Kai agreed with the kind of casual acceptance that made everyone present slightly nervous. So basically, you've spent your career studying human language patterns without ever actually studying human language patterns. That's definitely one approach. The academic equivalent of a nuclear weapon had just been detonated in the center of Harmony's Edge Station's most prestigious conference room. Every delegate present recognized the implications. Their field's most celebrated expert on primitive communication patterns had just been accused of building her entire career on theoretical sand. Velixia's response climbed through several octaves of crystalline outrage. I hardly think a representative of such a linguistically limited species is qualified to critique established xenolinguistic methodologies. Linguistically limited, Kai repeated, rolling the words around like he was testing their flavor. That's fascinating. What exactly makes you think human linguistic capacity is limited? The question was delivered with such genuine curiosity that it took several seconds for the trap to become apparent. Velixia had built her reputation on the premise that human communication was primitive by galactic standards. Now she was being asked to prove it, in front of an audience of her peers, to an actual human. The evidence is quite clear, she began, but her harmonics lacked their previous confidence. Single-channel vocal communication, minimal tonal variation, crude phonetic structures. Single-channel. Kai interrupted, and suddenly his accent seemed less like a limitation and more like a choice. Minimal tonal variation, crude phonetic structures. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something that made every linguist present check their translation devices. See, the funny thing about human linguistic evolution, he continued, and now he was speaking with what sounded like a completely different accent, one that carried the precision of classical education overlaying the practical foundations of his original speech pattern, is that we didn't develop language in isolation. We developed it while competing with every other predator, prey, animal, and environmental hazard our planet could throw at us. His voice shifted again, this time taking on tonal qualities that made the Mandorian delegates lean forward with sudden interest. Which means we didn't have the luxury of developing communication systems optimized for a single environment or social structure. We had to develop systems that worked everywhere, with everyone, under any conditions. Velixia's crystalline confidence was beginning to show stress fractures. Surely you're not suggesting that primitive survival pressures could produce linguistic sophistication comparable to? Oh, I'm not suggesting anything, Kai said, his voice now carrying harmonics that made Velixia's own species' wind chime communications sound monotonous by comparison. I'm demonstrating. And then he began to speak. What emerged from his vocal apparatus was not the crude, limited communication system that Galactic Linguistics had categorized as primitive Terran speech patterns. It was a cascade of linguistic complexity that made every translation device in the room emit small sounds of electronic distress. He started with what the audience recognized as standard galactic languages, but his pronunciation was flawless across species barriers that should have been physiologically impossible. The ethereal delegations' mouths formed perfect circles of shock as he replicated their interpretive dance language using only vocal modulations. The Crexian miners forgot to maintain their dignified academic postures as he demonstrated pitch patterns their own linguists claimed were untranslatable. But that was just the warm-up. Kai shifted into what could only be described as a linguistic tour de force of his own species. The accent that Velixia had dismissed as crude and primitive began to fragment and multiply, revealing itself as just one option in an arsenal of communicative possibilities that defied every assumption about Deathworld linguistic limitations. He spoke with the crisp precision of what humans called received pronunciation, then shifted into the musical cadences of Irish Gaelic, then into the tonal complexities of Mandarin, then into the click languages of Southern Africa, and then into combinations that shouldn't have been physically possible. His vocal cords were producing sounds simultaneously in ranges that most species required separate organs to achieve. And he was just getting started. The thing about human linguistic development, he explained while somehow maintaining 3 different tonal patterns simultaneously, is that we didn't just evolve one language. We evolved the capacity for all languages. Velixia's harmonics had devolved into something resembling a tea kettle having an existential crisis. Her carefully constructed theories about primitive Deathworld communication were crumbling in real time as she watched a single human demonstrate linguistic flexibility that shouldn't have been theoretically possible. You see, Kai continued, now speaking in what appeared to be a fusion of sign language and spoken word that created meaning through gestures her translation device couldn't even begin to process. When your species develops communication while sharing a planet with creatures that hunt by sound, prey animals that communicate through subsonic frequencies, and weather patterns that can drown out any single vocal range, you don't optimize for elegance. You optimize for adaptability. He paused, and in that pause, every linguist present realized they were watching their entire field's foundational assumptions being casually demolished by someone whose accent they had dismissed as primitive 5 minutes earlier. But the really interesting part, Kai said, his voice now shifting through dialectical variations so rapidly that Velixia's translation system was beginning to emit small sparks, is what happens when you take a communication system that evolved under those pressures and give it a few thousand years to really develop. What happened next could only be described as linguistic warfare conducted at the speed of thought. Kai began to speak in patterns that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. His voice carried overtones and undertones that created meaning through acoustic interference patterns. He was somehow producing phonemes that existed in the spaces between sounds, crafting sentences that meant different things depending on which harmonic frequencies the listener's brain chose to process. Velixia's crystalline structure began to resonate in sympathy with acoustic patterns she couldn't parse. Her own vocal apparatus, evolved for the refined harmonics of her homeworld's crystal caves, was simply not equipped to process communication that treated the entire acoustic spectrum as a canvas rather than a constraint. Her attempts to respond devolved rapidly from elegant crystalline harmonics to sounds that resembled a glass orchestra having a nervous breakdown. The sophisticated linguistic structures that had made her the galaxy's premier authority on primitive communication patterns crumbled under the assault of actually encountering a communication system that had evolved not for elegance, but for survival. The beautiful thing about human linguistic evolution, Kai explained while casually demonstrating vowel patterns that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions, is that we never lost any of it. Every accent you dismiss as primitive contains the full complexity of our species' communicative development. We don't speak simply because we can't speak complexly. We speak simply because we choose to. Velixia's response had deteriorated to pure harmonics, with no linguistic content whatsoever. Her translation device had given up and was now producing a steady stream of error messages in 17 different languages. Around the amphitheater, other delegates were backing away as a vocal apparatus produced frequencies that made their own communication systems uncomfortable. But since you seem to prefer theoretical frameworks to practical demonstrations, Kai said, his voice returning to something approaching normal human speech patterns while maintaining just enough of the previous complexity to remind everyone of what they had witnessed, let me put this in terms your academic methodology can appreciate. He smiled with the particular satisfaction of someone who had just proven a point they had been looking forward to making for a very long time. Human linguistic capacity isn't limited by our Deathworld origins. It's enhanced by them. Every environmental pressure that you assumed constrained our development actually expanded it. We didn't evolve one perfect language for one perfect environment. We evolved the ability to create perfect languages for any environment we encountered. Velixia's attempts at speech had devolved to sounds that her own species typically associated with extreme emotional distress. Her crystalline features were cycling through configurations that suggested her brain was attempting to process linguistic concepts that simply didn't fit within her theoretical framework. The medical team that arrived to assist her spent several fascinating minutes trying to determine whether she was experiencing a linguistic seizure or a philosophical breakdown. The final diagnosis was both. As they helped her from the amphitheater, her vocal apparatus, still producing confused harmonics that resembled questions she couldn't figure out how to ask, Kai returned to his original accent with the casual ease of someone changing clothes. Anyway, he said to the stunned assembly of galactic linguistics experts, that's basically why Terra University focuses on applied linguistics instead of theoretical speculation. Turns out it's harder to make embarrassing assumptions about how people communicate when you actually listen to how people communicate. The symposium continued for 3 more days, but the conversations had fundamentally shifted. The delegates spent most of their time quietly revising papers that had suddenly become obsolete and wondering how many other primitive species they had categorized based on theoretical frameworks rather than actual observation. Velixia eventually recovered her ability to speak coherently, though she never again used the phrase linguistically limited without a small shudder. Her subsequent research focused exclusively on species whose communication systems she could study through direct observation rather than theoretical assumption, a methodological shift that her peers noted improved her work considerably. Kai returned to Terra with a reputation as the human who had single-handedly restructured galactic linguistics, though he seemed more interested in his next research project than in academic celebrity. When asked about his experience at the symposium, he typically responded with a shrug and the observation that people tend to hear what they expect to hear, right up until you give them something they weren't expecting. The final irony, which became apparent only months later when xenolinguistic researchers began conducting actual field studies of human communication patterns, was that Kai had been holding back. The linguistic demonstration that had short-circuited the galaxy's premier expert on primitive communication had represented perhaps 10% of human linguistic capacity, carefully modulated to avoid causing permanent damage to translation systems that weren't designed to process truly complex communication patterns. The galaxy's linguistic establishment spent the following decade quietly revising their assumptions about the relationship between environmental pressure and communicative sophistication. The new working theory suggested that perhaps survival-based linguistic development produced not limitations, but rather capabilities that academic environments were simply too refined to recognize. As for the Deathworlders themselves, they continued communicating with the same casual complexity they had always employed, blissfully unaware that their primitive speech patterns had caused a fundamental revolution in galactic linguistics. After all, they had more important things to worry about than whether their accents sounded sophisticated enough for academic approval. They had real conversations to conduct.